For years, we've seen data showing that boys and young men are falling farther and farther behind in their education. Girls are now outpacing boys in the classroom and it's having long-lasting effects. One study showing boys are less likely to graduate high school on time by as much as 10% in some states. Now, some schools are starting to make changes in the hopes of combating this trend. Let's bring in NBC News correspondent and News Now anchor Morgan Radford with a look at some of those changes. Morgan, good to see you. Is this becoming a national trend?
It is becoming a trend, and in some pretty creative and interesting ways. Schools are starting to address this in unique ways and really look at the fact that boys and young men are learning and how they're learning differently and how they can ultimately thrive. So we visited one school that went all in on helping boys learn from the playground to the classroom.
It's just past 8 a.m. here at Boys Latin School in Baltimore, and while the classrooms are empty, the school is buzzing with activity.
In the mornings, we have open gym, like play basketball.
We do scale modeling.
The reason? A wave of changes designed to solve a growing gender gap in education, with boys at least half a grade level behind their female peers in reading in nearly every U.S. state, and nearly 1 million fewer young men heading off to college compared to their female counterparts. Which is why, starting last year, this private all-boys school decided to do something about it.
Oh, okay.
With 3 big changes: a ban on cell phones, a first period for activities, and more time for hands-on projects, away from desks.
Show of hands, how many of you think these changes have been positive? All of you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've been getting better grades. I've also been happier in class.
Why do you think you've been happier?
Because before I was just tired and I didn't want to be at school. When I get woken up, I just feel like I'm ready for the day.
We hear a lot of discussions out in the world about how young men are isolated, how young men are angry, how young men are lonely. Do you see that playing out in the world?
I can't really speak on loneliness, but it does take away a lot of negative emotions like anger, anxiety.
If you don't have your phone, you're saying?
If you don't have your phone, yeah.
It really just helps us all feel like we're connected and together.
It's the American dream.
Headmaster Chris Post calls it a win-win.
How much does it cost to make changes like these?
It costs virtually nothing. A few $100s for a phone locker and for plastic tubs to put your phone in.
Are these changes working?
Absenteeism is probably lower year on year. Certainly there are fewer and fewer student latenesses. Kids are excited to come to school.
The changes, part of a growing nationwide movement to make education more boy-friendly, spurred in part by a new organization called the American Institute for Boys and Men.
The alarm bells are really ringing now in classrooms, which is to say, just our boys aren't doing well enough. There are twice as many girls at the top of the class, in the top 10%, as there are boys. Boys are much more likely to be suspended, much less likely to finish school on time. So the overall story is pretty clear that our education system is not serving our boys well enough.
What would you say to critics who say, look, girls could benefit from these changes too? Why is this specific to young men?
We want to find ways that lift everybody up, but which particularly offer a helping hand to those who are falling furthest behind. And in schools, that's very clearly boys.
When you talk about boys being on sort of the lower end of this so-called gap in society, as you mentioned, people in this political moment might call that DEI. They might say, well, why then would you sit here and make accommodations for the group that is falling behind, in this case, young men, and that this is really just a cultural issue?
Yeah, it's a very interesting moment to be having this conversation, because that is something that we're hearing in our work now sometimes. But data-driven DEI, or whatever you want to call it, is just good policy. But it's very important that it's driven by the data.
Why are you looking at my hair?
For Michael Palmisano and his son Blake,
Have you noticed a change in your son since he's enrolled here?
Yes, very much so. I've seen him ready to go to school instead of kind of retreating and pulling back. And I think so much of that is that they let boys be boys and they just go all in on that.
All in on a new school experience.
And the expert you just heard from, Richard Reeves, he really stresses throughout his writing that this is not a culture war issue. And he's careful to point out that these differences between young men and women are on average, which means acknowledging those exceptions in testing and learning ability that can fall within, frankly, any group.
NBC's Morgan Radford with a very important story. Morgan, thank you so much.